Right now, there's a university in England that's been teaching students continuously since before the Aztec Empire even existed. Not close, over 200 years before. A T-Rex lived closer in time to you reading this sentence than it did to a Stegosaurus. Sharks are older than trees. History is absolutely packed with facts that sound like someone made them up for a joke, except every single one of them is completely real. So today, we're going through 10 of the wildest ones, and honestly, some of these are going to mess with how you think about time itself. Let's get into it. Let's start with that Oxford fact, because it genuinely never stops being wild, no matter how many times you hear it. Teaching at Oxford University began as early as 1096, and by 1249 it already had organized colleges with actual student housing. The Aztec Empire? The city of Tenochtitlan wasn't even founded until 1325, more than 2 centuries later, and the empire itself didn't fully form as a political power until around 1428. So by the time the Aztecs were laying the first stones of their capital, Oxford had already been teaching students for over 200 years. An English university is, chronologically speaking, older than one of history's most iconic ancient civilizations. Your brain files ancient Aztecs and modern university into completely different mental categories, and history just doesn't care about that at all. Speaking of things being way older than you'd expect, sharks are older than trees. Sharks first appeared in the fossil record roughly 400 million years ago. The earliest trees didn't show up until around 350 million years ago. So for tens of millions of years, sharks were swimming around on a planet that didn't have a single tree standing anywhere on it yet. Imagine an entire ecosystem of ocean predators existing before the concept of a forest was even invented by nature. Now here's one that consistently breaks people's brains, and it involves actual living animals overlapping with human engineering. Woolly mammoths were still alive when the pyramids of Egypt were being built. Most mammoth populations went extinct thousands of years earlier, but a small, isolated population survived on Wrangel Island, off the coast of Siberia, until roughly 1700 BC, hundreds of years after the Great Pyramid of Giza was already standing. While Egyptian engineers were putting the finishing touches on one of the most advanced construction projects in the ancient world, actual living, breathing mammoths were still wandering around a frozen island a few thousand miles away, completely unaware that pyramids even existed. And speaking of Egypt, here's a fact that always gets people, every single time. Cleopatra lived closer in time to the moon landing than she did to the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The pyramid was built around 2560 BC. Cleopatra ruled Egypt around 30 BC. That's a gap of roughly 2,500 years. From Cleopatra's reign to the 1969 moon landing is only about 2,000 years. Ancient Egypt itself lasted so incredibly long that its own internal timeline barely fits inside our heads properly. Cleopatra is, historically speaking, closer to us than she is to the pyramid she supposedly represents in most people's minds. Let's talk about the Great Pyramid a bit more, because here's another fact that puts its scale into perspective. The Great Pyramid of Giza was the tallest man-made structure on the entire planet for almost 3,800 years. It wasn't surpassed in height until the construction of Lincoln Cathedral in England in the 1300s. Nearly 4,000 years of holding the title uninterrupted, which is a record that basically nothing else in human construction history even comes close to touching. Now let's take a genuinely wild detour into dinosaurs for a second, because this one honestly might be the best fact on this entire list. A Tyrannosaurus rex lived closer in time to modern humans than it did to a Stegosaurus. Stegosaurus roamed the Earth roughly 150 million years ago. T-Rex didn't show up until around 66 million years ago. That's an 84 million year gap between the two dinosaurs. Meanwhile, the gap between T-Rex and now is only about 66 million years. So if a T-Rex somehow saw a Stegosaurus fossil, it would have been looking at something more ancient to it than the T-Rex itself is to us. We picture all dinosaurs as one big prehistoric group hanging out together, and that's just not remotely how it worked. Now let's shift gears entirely and talk about something a lot more modern. Nintendo. Yes, the video game company. Nintendo was actually founded all the way back in 1889, originally as a company making handmade Japanese playing cards called Hanafuda. For over 60 years, Nintendo had absolutely nothing to do with video games at all. It wasn't until the 1970s and 80s that the company pivoted toward electronic entertainment, eventually becoming the gaming giant we know today. So for the majority of its existence, the company that gave us Mario was just making cards. Here's one that sounds like it has to be a joke, but it's genuinely documented history. In 1896, Britain fought what's officially recognized as the shortest war in recorded history, against Zanzibar. The entire conflict lasted somewhere between 38 and 45 minutes, depending on the source, before Zanzibar's forces surrendered. Some wars in history dragged on for literal decades, tearing apart entire generations. This one was basically over before most people would have even finished their lunch break. Let's talk about ketchup, because this one is genuinely bizarre once you actually sit with it. In the 1830s, ketchup was actually sold in the United States as a medicine, specifically in pill form, marketed as a cure for various digestive ailments like diarrhea and indigestion. It was sold under names implying serious medical benefits, and people genuinely bought it believing it was legitimate medicine, not a condiment you'd eventually put on French fries a century later. Now let's talk about Harvard, because this one plays into that same older than you'd expect theme running through this whole list. Harvard University was founded in 1636. Calculus, the branch of mathematics most of us associate with painful high school memories, wasn't developed until the late 1600s by Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz working independently of each other. Meaning Harvard was already educating students for decades before calculus, as an entire formal mathematical field technically existed anywhere on Earth. Let's talk about something a lot heavier to close this list out. Germany only finished paying off its reparations from World War I in 2010. The Treaty of Versailles imposed massive financial reparations on Germany after the war ended in 1918, and due to economic collapse, multiple renegotiations, and the interruption of an entire Second World War, the final payment on that original World War I debt wasn't actually completed until nearly a century later, in 2010. People alive today have lived through the actual final payment of a war debt from over 100 years earlier. And finally, one more financial fact that honestly might be the most unsettling one on this entire list. Haiti was forced to pay reparations to France, essentially compensating former slaveholders for the loss of their so-called property as a condition of international recognition after Haiti's successful revolution and independence in 1804. Those payments, renegotiated and refinanced multiple times through loans from French banks, weren't fully paid off until 1947. A nation was financially paying for the crime of achieving its own freedom for well over a century straight. So when you put all of these facts side by side, it becomes pretty clear that history rarely lines up the way our brains want to imagine it. Ancient civilizations overlap with things we consider modern. Dinosaurs we assume were neighbors were actually separated by tens of millions of years. Wars that supposedly changed the world sometimes lasted less time than a movie. Companies we associate with one thing spent decades doing something completely different first. And sometimes the most unbelievable facts on the planet aren't the dramatic ones at all. They're just simple timelines that nobody ever bothered explaining properly. Anyway, those are 10 historical facts that sound completely fake but are entirely real. If you found this one interesting, let me know in the comments which fact actually surprised you the most. No cap, that's the file. Catch you next time.